In the Star Trek universe, some characters are simply unforgettable. Captain Kirk, Spock, and Bones are household names, absolute icons of science fiction. But there's another crew member who, despite her short time on screen, made a huge impact. To millions of fans, she was Yeoman Janice Rand, a walking symbol of the bright, hopeful 23rd century. With her legendary blonde beehive and professional cool, she was a vital part of the bridge crew, a confidant to Captain Kirk, and a stand-in for the everyday person on the wild ride that was the Starship Enterprise. Amidst all the cosmic wonders and alien threats, she was the relatable girl next door, the one handling the paperwork and bringing the coffee, grounding the epic adventures in a slice of human reality. But the life of the actress who played her, Grace Lee Whitney, was anything but a utopian fantasy. It was a story that ran from a traumatic childhood of abandonment all the way to being unceremoniously fired from the show she adored. And that firing wasn't just about ratings or budget cuts. In 1966, something happened behind the scenes at Desilu Studios that would haunt her forever. A powerful studio executive sexually assaulted her just days before she was mysteriously let go from the biggest show on TV. The trauma from that night, piled on top of losing her dream job, threw her into a downward spiral of addiction, despair, and even homelessness. This is the heartbreaking personal struggle and the inspiring comeback story of the woman behind the Starfleet uniform. Grace Lee Whitney's story starts with a detail that feels almost poetically cruel. She was born just after midnight on April 1, 1930, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, registered as Mary Ann Chase. It was April Fool's Day. Her biological mother, facing the stigma of having a child out of wedlock, signed away her parental rights and disappeared, never once looking at her baby. The birth certificate had a blank space where a father's name should have been, leaving the newborn with a lifetime of unanswered questions. Weeks later, the infant was adopted by a couple who gave her a new name, Grace Elaine Whitney. Her adoptive mother celebrated with pink lemonade and a cake that read, "No fooling, she's ours." It was a sweet joke, but for Grace it was one that she said made her laugh and ache. The date of her birth became a shadow she could never quite escape. She often told people, "I'm living proof that April Fool's jokes can last 85 years. But secretly, she carried the painful belief that her very existence was a mistake. That deep wound of abandonment echoed through her life. The feeling of being unwanted haunted her. When Grace was 7, her world fell apart when her mother casually confessed that she was adopted. The word real suddenly felt like a weapon. In her own words, she felt like the floor had opened up and swallowed her whole. That night, full of rage and confusion, she tore the lace from her favorite dress, furious that her life felt like a lie. After that, things changed. The trauma showed up in quiet, heartbreaking ways. She started sleepwalking. She hoarded milk, cartons from school, a small, desperate act to have something of her own. She stopped wanting birthday parties, explaining with a child's crushing logic, "Guests always go home." This feeling of being displaced and the desperate need for acceptance would fuel her for the rest of her life. It lit a fire in her to perform, to earn the love and validation she felt she'd been denied from birth. Performance was her refuge. Years later, she'd call her iconic Star Trek hairstyle helmet hair that hides the abandoned kid underneath, a raw admission of the pain she carried. Her teenage years were a mix of dazzling talent and hidden turmoil. She started drinking at 17, later admitting it was an attempt to silence the voice of that little girl who felt thrown away. But on the surface, she was a star. At just 14, Grace was a girl singer on Detroit's WJR radio, a major station. A local department store sponsored her, and her face was soon on billboards. A lipstick was even named after her. She juggled work and school, running from the radio station to class, then back for rehearsals, sleeping just a few hours a night. By 15, She was paying her parents' mortgage and donating to the very orphanage system she came from, trying to help the other babies who hadn't been chosen yet. At 18, wanting more, she moved to Chicago with $37 and a hat box. She started going. By Whitney, hoping to be seen as more than just another pretty singer. Her talent was impossible to ignore. She landed a gig at the famous Blue Note Club, opening for jazz legends like Billie Holiday and Buddy Rich. It was an intoxicating, intimidating world. Holiday earned $1,000 a week. Grace made just $55. She lived in a cheap boarding house, surviving on hot dogs, but she studied Holiday every night, soaking up lessons on phrasing and stage presence. She also toured with the eccentric Spike Jones and Fred Waring bands, honing her craft before setting her sights on the bright lights of Broadway. Grace Lee Whitney hit New York and immediately made her mark. In 1952, she debuted on Broadway in the musical Top Banana, starring the legendary Phil Silvers. It was a hit, and during the show she met and married the band's drummer, Sidney Stephen Dweck. When the show was made into a film in 1954, Grace reprised her role, officially making the jump to Hollywood. Throughout the 50s and early 60s, she was the definition of a working actress, appearing in over 100 TV shows, from Gunsmoke and The Rifleman to The Untouchables and The Outer Limits. She was a semi-regular on more than 80 live TV shows, doing comedy sketches and appearing as a Vanna White type on the popular show Queen for a Day. Her film career was also taking off, with roles in the horror classic House of Wax and Billy, Wilder's iconic comedy Some Like It Hot. In that film, she played a member of the all-female band, sharing scenes with Jack Lemmon, Tony Curtis, and Marilyn Monroe. In 1965, she met a producer named Gene Roddenberry, who cast her in a TV pilot called Police Story. The pilot didn't sell, but Roddenberry saw something in her. When his other pilot, a sci-fi show called Star Trek, got the green light, he knew who he wanted. He cast her as Yeoman Janice Rand, personal assistant to Captain Kirk. Rand was designed to be a major character from the start, an emotional anchor for the captain and the audience. Early promotional materials for the show heavily featured Whitney, alongside William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy. The unspoken attraction between Rand and Kirk was a key part of their dynamic. For Grace, who had always felt like an outsider, this was more than a job. She later wrote, "When I stepped aboard the Starship Enterprise, I truly felt I was home. After years of temporary roles, she finally belonged. But that hopeful future didn't last. Almost immediately, NBC executives got nervous. They worried that the steady will-they-won't-they relationship between Kirk and Rand would make the captain seem unavailable to the female guest stars and to the show's female audience. The pressure grew. Despite being a fan favorite, Whitney's screen time was cut again and again. Then, on September 8, 1966, the very day Star Trek premiered, her agent was told her contract was terminated. The official story was budget cuts and creative decisions. But for Whitney, the reason was much darker. Just a few days earlier, after a wrap party, a senior executive at Desilu Productions invited her to his office. In her autobiography, The Longest Trek, she described how the man sexually assaulted her. Shaken, the first person she told was Leonard Nimoy. She showed up at his home, an incoherent mess. Nimoy listened and became her fiercest supporter, a friend who understood the gravity of what had happened. When she was fired, she couldn't separate the two events in her mind. The pain was immense. To make it worse, she had to watch another. Actress read lines that were originally written for her. The dream job that felt like home had been ripped away, leaving a trauma that would send her into a freefall. Gene Roddenberry later called firing Whitney the dumbest mistake of his career, admitting he'd given in to network pressure. He even wrote a memo suggesting they bring her back, but the call never came. For Grace, the damage was done. Getting fired from Star Trek wasn't just losing a job, It was a blow that reactivated all her childhood wounds of abandonment. The line between Grace Lee Whitney and Janice Rand had blurred. When Janice was fired, Grace felt she had been erased. The home she thought she'd found on the Enterprise had thrown her out into the cold. Her life unraveled fast. The secret trauma of the assault, combined with the public humiliation of being fired, sent her into a deep depression. She turned to alcohol, not just to cope, but to self-destruct. I was lost, and I began to bottom out, she recalled. Her addiction took over everything. She started using amphetamines, Dr. Feelgood pills, to stay thin. This cocktail of drugs and alcohol pulled her deeper into the abyss. Her career vanished. The phone stopped ringing. Her first marriage ended the same year she was fired, and a second marriage in 1970 would also end in divorce. She later wrote honestly about this period, describing how addiction led to a life of chaos and promiscuity. The fall was brutal. She lost her home, her savings, and herself. For several years, the woman who had been a symbol of a hopeful future was homeless, living on Skid Row in Los Angeles. It was a world away from the gleaming corridors of the Enterprise. The horror peaked when she was sexually assaulted again, this time by a group of men. I wanted to die, she wrote, so I tried to drink myself to death. It was at this absolute lowest point that a lifeline appeared, and it came from the friend who knew her pain from the beginning, Leonard Nimoy. Nimoy had never lost touch. He saw her struggle and refused to let her disappear. He urged her to find help, to try a 12-step program. He talked to her about faith. His unwavering support was what she needed to take the first step toward recovery. She would later say he saved her life. The journey back would be long, but it was one she was finally ready to start. Grace Lee Whitney began her journey to sobriety in the early 1980s. When she walked into her first 12-step meeting, she was a self-described total atheist. But in the rooms of recovery, she found a new kind of spiritual connection. My group of sober people was my higher power, she explained, until I developed a personal relationship with the Creator. This faith became her foundation. By 1981, she was sober, a milestone she maintained for the rest of her life. Sobriety gave her the clarity to look at her past differently. For years, she believed her drinking had caused her to be fired. A huge turning point came when she learned the truth from old studio memos. The decision was made for budgetary reasons and to keep Kirk romantically free. Learning the sexual assault and her behavior had nothing to do with it was a massive liberation. It justifies me as an actress, restores my reputation, she said. The guilt finally lifted. As she rebuilt her life, the Star Trek family started to welcome her back, starting with the fans. She began attending conventions and was shocked by the love they showed her. They'd never forgotten Yeoman Rand. This connection was healing. When I told the fans I was an alcoholic, they all applauded, she said. It was the acceptance she'd always craved. Then, the studio called. After hearing that fans were always asking about her, Whitney got in touch with Gene Roddenberry's office. Roddenberry, filled with regret, was thrilled and offered to bring Rand back for the planned TV revival, Star Trek Phase 2. He called firing her his greatest mistake. Phase 2 eventually became Star Trek The Motion Picture, 1979, and Roddenberry kept his promise. Stepping back onto the Enterprise set after more than a decade was, in her words, the thrill of my life. Though her role was small, it was huge for her. Janice Rand was back, promoted to Chief Petty Officer and serving as Transporter Chief. For audiences, it was a welcome return. For Grace, it was redemption. However, the pressure of the film was intense. Unhappy with her appearance on screen and still using marijuana at the time, she had a brief relapse into drinking. But that experience was her final wake-up call, strengthening her resolve to stay sober for good. her comeback was cemented by her old friend. When Leonard Nimoy directed Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, 1984, he made sure she was in it. She returned again for Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, 1986. Each appearance was another step back into the fold. The journey was long, but Yeoman Rand and the resilient actress who played her had finally come home. Grace Lee Whitney's return to Star Trek peaked in Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, 1991. She was no longer a yeoman, but Lieutenant Commander Janice Rand, communications officer on the USS Excelsior under Captain Sulu. This promotion mirrored her own hard-won battle for respect. She played the role one last time in a 1996 Star Trek Voyager episode Flashback for the franchise's 30th anniversary. Appearing with her friend George Takei, she showed her deep love for the universe and its fans. She even appeared in fan-made productions, embracing her role as a beloved legacy figure. But the most courageous chapter of her later life was her 1998 autobiography, The Longest Trek: My Tour of the Galaxy, with a foreword by Leonard Nimoy. In it, she laid her life bare. She wrote about her adoption, her early career, and for the first time, told the full story of the sexual assault and her firing. She powerfully refused to name her attacker, stating, "This is my story, not his." The book was a revelation. It detailed her descent into addiction, her years of despair, and her ultimate recovery. By telling her truth, she broke decades of silence, helping to tear down the stigma around assault and addiction in Hollywood. This transformed her from a troubled actress into a powerful advocate. Her struggles became her platform. In 1993, she moved to Coarsegold, California, to be near her son and dedicate herself to service. She became a certified alcohol and drug counselor, spending the last 35 years of her life helping others. She spoke in churches, prisons, and community centers, becoming a beacon of hope. Star Trek conventions became her ministry. She would meet struggling fans and share her story, offering them the same hope she had found. Her son Jonathan later said she wanted to be remembered more as a survivor of addiction than as a Star Trek cast member. In finding her way out of the darkness, she spent her life lighting the path for others. Grace Lee Whitney's story is one of incredible resilience and the power of second chances. Do you remember Yeoman Janice Rand from the original series? What did her character and her eventual return to the franchise mean to you? Share your memories and thoughts in the comments below. And if you find stories of overcoming adversity inspiring, please consider subscribing for more in-depth looks at the lives of classic television stars. Grace Lee Whitney passed away on May 1, 2015, at her home in Coarsegold at the age of 85. Her life was a story of bright stardom and deep shadow, of devastating trauma and incredible redemption. The April Fool's baby, who felt like a mistake, ended her life as a symbol of hope for thousands. Her legacy is double-sided. In the Star Trek universe, she'll always be Yeoman Janice Rand, the character whose quiet strength captured hearts. Her journey from yeoman to commander shows her enduring popularity and importance to the franchise. But her greater legacy lies beyond the final frontier. It's in her courage to speak her truth. By sharing her story of assault and addiction, she gave a voice to the voiceless and offered a path to recovery. Her son was right. She was proudest of being a survivor. Her life wasn't defined by getting fired from Star Trek, but by her triumphant return, not just to a movie set, but to herself. Grace Lee Whitney's longest trek was her journey from despair back into the light, proving that even after the darkest night, a new dawn is always possible.